QVO 89 knows exactly what he is. He knows Cawl built him. He knows there were 88 before him. He knows the entire history of the project he represents. This series of incrementally refined approximations stretching back nearly 10,000 years, because it's layered into his consciousness along with everything else Cawl put there. And when Belisarius Cawl looks at him, this Archmagos who has outlasted empires, engineered post-human soldiers in secret, and outwitted beings that were old when the Imperium was young. When Cawl looks at QVO, sometimes the wrong name comes out, and QVO has to correct him. Again. That is the story nobody tells when they explain Belisarius Cawl. They tell you about the contingency plans, the Primaris Marines, the heist. They tell you about the plot armor. And they're right, because the plot armor is real, and by general consensus it has the density of a stellar remnant. But they stop before they reach the detail that makes the heist land as something other than another entry in a very long ledger of inevitable wins. 89 iterations. 89 times the answer is the same. Start from the beginning. Belisarius Cawl holds the title of Archmagos Dominus of the Adeptus Mechanicus. He is 10,000 standard years old, which puts his origins around the time of the Horus Heresy, the civil war that broke the Imperium's spine and never quite let it heal. In the time since, he has accumulated technical knowledge, political enemies, and improbable victories in roughly that order. And at this point, the three are close to indistinguishable. The victory that built his reputation was the Primaris Marines. Before Rabute Guilliman went into suspended animation after the heresy, he commissioned Cawl to improve the Space Marine. Not adjust, not revise. Improve, in the full meaning of the word, which turned out to require rewriting a significant portion of the genetic work done by a literal demigod. Cawl accepted the commission, didn't mention it to anyone else, and spent the next 10,000 years actually executing it. While the Imperium occupied those millennia losing wars, collapsing sectors, and generally performing at the standard Imperial baseline of managed catastrophe, Cawl spent them in the lab. When Guilliman woke up, the Primaris Marines were ready. The consistent read from the Black Library novels is that Cawl's response to being told a plan of his won't work, or shouldn't be attempted, or isn't sanctioned, or violates 17 separate articles of Mechanicus doctrine, is to proceed and be right. He has been doing this for 10,000 years. The Adeptus Mechanicus, as an institution, hasn't found a mechanism for stopping him. At some point, the doctrine violations became the legacy. The Necron pylon heist is the most audacious operation in his 10,000-year career. By the standard complaint logic, it should land flat. Of course he pulled it off. He always pulls it off. What changes the calculation are the 89 failures running behind it. Not battle failures, not technical failures. The one specific personal failure that he has been running for most of his operational life, that he has applied every engineering tool at his disposal to solving, and that keeps returning the same answer. To understand what the heist cost him, you need Trisolian A4. The Horus Heresy is large enough to swallow entire careers without registering them on the larger history. 2 Mechanicus personnel training under a Magus Domina named Hester Aspertia Sigma Sigma on Trisolian A4 is exactly the kind of footnote that disappears. What distinguishes their story is the exit. During the conflicts of that period, Belisarius Cawl and his colleague Friedrich Adam Silip Quo kill Aspertia together and escape the Trisolian system. That's how Friedrich enters the canonical record. Not his background, not his technical accomplishments. He enters as the other person in the room when Cawl kills their teacher and runs. Aspertia's specialty is worth holding on to: soul merging. Mechanicus technology for imprinting consciousness patterns across different vessels, for taking the architecture of a mind and transferring it into a new substrate. It's the kind of capability that sounds theoretical until you see what Cawl does with it across the following 10,000 years. He learned it from Aspertia before they killed her. The knowledge survived the teacher. After the heresy ends, Friedish is killed on Terra. The specific mechanics involve a geneticist named Ezekiel Sedaine and his operative, Ultrix Herminia, who pulls the trigger. Sedaine apparently understood what Cawl was capable of and understood what Cawl wanted. Sedaine apparently held out the restoration of Friedish through the soul-merging techniques that Aspertia had taught, as the price of Cawl's compliance with his own experiments. Whether Cawl cooperated, whether the promise had any genuine substance, whether restoration was ever actually attempted, the sources don't cleanly resolve that. What they resolve is that Friedish stayed dead. The architecture of that leverage is worth sitting with. The technology used as a bargaining chip to keep Friedish's return just out of reach is the same technology Cawl would spend the next 10 millennia turning toward the same goal. The tool weaponized against him became his primary instrument. He learned soul merging from the woman they both killed. Sedaine used the promise of applying it to extract compliance from Cawl. And then, somehow, the situation resolved without Friedish coming back. What Cawl was left with was the grief, the technique, and the knowledge of exactly what it would take to produce an approximation of what he had lost. He started building. The QVO clone series is the result. The lexicanum entry for Friedish Adam Silip QVO, and the existence of this entry, covering a man dead for nearly 10,000 years, is itself a data point, confirms that Cawl created the series because he didn't want to be parted from Friedish, described in the source material as a peculiar fit of sentimentality. Each clone is a heavily modified version of the original, implanted with thought patterns via the limited soul-merging technology Aspertia had pioneered. Here is the architecture of why it fails, every time. The thought patterns Cawl can implant are his own. He doesn't have Friedish's patterns to transfer. Friedish is dead, and whatever continuity of consciousness he carried died with him. What Cawl can do is layer himself into the substrate, add Friedish's physical and cognitive profile, refine the approximation across iterations. Each QVO carries Cawl's thought patterns alongside the best reconstruction of Friedish's that Cawl can engineer. And Cawl knows Friedish is gone. That knowledge is part of who Cawl is. It's baked into the patterns he layers in. Which means each QVO, built from those patterns, carrying that knowledge, also knows from the inside that it isn't the person Cawl is looking for. He gave them the grief and the reason for it, simultaneously, in the same operation. Each iteration wakes up already aware of its own inadequacy, carrying Cawl's own mourning embedded at the cognitive foundation level, precise enough to know exactly what it is failing to be. The iterative refinement is real. Each successive QVO is described as more accurate to the original Friedish than the last. Across 89 attempts, Cawl has been shaving fractions off the gap between what he has and what he lost. The 89th version is more accurate to Friedish than the 88th by whatever margin his engineering can produce across one more cycle of refinement. He is asymptotically approaching the original. It's still not Friedish. Belisarius Cawl, The Great Work, a Black Library novel predating the Archmagos heist, has the scene on the page. Cawl addresses QVO 87, calling him Friedish. Never better, my dear Friedish. QVO 87 looks at him with what the text describes as a sympathetic smile. I am not Friedish, Magos. Bang! The narrative records a noise. Cawl is thrown, but only a moment. Just a moment. Then he continues. That flinch is in the official text, not community interpretation. The canonical Cawl, 10,000 years old and operating at cognitive altitudes most beings can't access, gets knocked sideways by 5 words from a clone of his dead friend. 5 words that he knew were coming. 5 words that have been coming for 86 iterations before this one, and will keep coming for however many follow. A second excerpt from the same novel surfaces in lore discussions. Cawl. Friedish, dear Friedish, no wait, hang on, please, followed by him calling for cryogenic equipment. The specific crisis that triggered this isn't fully visible from the excerpt alone. What is visible is the quality of the voice, the composure stripped away completely. Not the Archmagos who outthought Gilliman, not the engineer who ran a secret genetics project for 10,000 years without detection. Someone whose control has a specific point of failure, and that failure has a specific name, and the name is always the same name. Lexicanum confirms that QVO 88 was deployed to assist Rabute Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade, sent to aid in an active, galaxy-wide military campaign. The 88th approximation of Friedish was functional enough for that. Whether deploying QVO 88 to a war zone represents confidence in the clone series, or Cawl's willingness to risk the closest thing he has to what he's looking for, the text doesn't say. It may not be a distinction Cawl was fully capable of separating at the time. QVO 89 is the current iteration, created after QVO 88's deployment, more accurate to the original, presumably. Still not Friedish. Trazyn the Infinite said something to Cawl at Cadia that lands differently once you have this context. Trazyn is the Necron overlord of solemnness, collector of historical artifacts, battle dioramas, significant specimens, Satan shards, warriors preserved in tesseract labyrinths, and objects he considers interesting enough to relocate from their original contexts to his gallery without necessarily consulting the original owners. He is, by any reasonable accounting, one of the most powerful entities in the galaxy, and he spends most of his operational existence cataloging and acquiring rather than conquering, which makes him stranger than the ones who conquer. Trazyn himself was transformed into a Necron against his will, stripped of his biological existence at the fires of biotransference, forcibly, by a process he didn't choose and couldn't refuse. He looked at Cawl, who has been voluntarily augmenting himself across 10,000 years, and said what the Fall of Cadian novel records. Perhaps, I went to the fires of biotransference in chains. You, I think, have gladly sliced away your humanity piece by piece. He wasn't wrong. Cawl has made those cuts deliberately, over millennia, replacing flesh with machinery, neurons with binary, organic continuity with something that has no adequate term in Imperial theology. He is something close to a mobile data processing cathedral wearing the memory of a person. The part that still calls QVO 87 Friedish hasn't been augmented away. Whatever remains of his original humanity has found the one thing it won't put on the table. Everything else, negotiable, replaceable, upgraded, revised across the iterative cycles of 10,000 years of self-modification. This, not. The grief over one dead colleague from the Horus heresy is still functional, still operational, still showing up in unguarded moments when the iteration number ticks upward and the answer stays the same. That's who is running the heist. The pylon crisis that eventually sent Cawl to a Necron world on a black hole's event horizon started with Cadia, and it started with an understanding of the pylons that Cawl had developed long before the 13th Black Crusade arrived at the planet. Necron pylons aren't simply warp-dampening devices in the way that a lead shield is a radiation-dampening device. They operate at a fundamental level, suppressing the connection between real space and the dimension that fuels chaos, interfering with the warp's ability to bleed into the physical universe at a given location. The network constructed into Cadia had been sitting at the mouth of the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years, with the Imperium stationed on top of it without fully understanding what it was sitting on. Cawl had been investigating what that network could actually do before Abaddon's forces even reached the planet. He had apparently also been reading Necron-tier theatrical works as background research, which is the kind of detail that explains why Cawl's relationship with Necron civilization is more nuanced than the standard Mechanicus posture of looting first and understanding later. By the time the 13th Black Crusade reached Cadia, Cawl had already been thinking about the pylons for longer than most civilizations last. Trazyn the Infinite arrived at Cadia with his own calculations. His stated motivation was legible. A chaos-consumed galaxy produces nothing worth adding to the gallery. A universe where the Eye of Terror swallows everything is a universe where Trazyn's collection becomes the most complete archive of a civilization that no longer exists. And that isn't the role he has spent 65 million years building toward. He wanted the eye closed. He found Cawl, and he offered what he knew about how to close it. The documented first response. Cawl drew his weapon. This is the correct first response to an unsolicited Necron overlord materializing during a planetary siege. It's also, apparently, not quite sufficient as a conversation ender because Trazyn had information Cawl needed and both of them knew it. According to a review of the Fall of Cadian novel, their subsequent conversation covered the etymology of abomination and included Cawl admitting to having read Necron tier dramas. This specific detail explains the functional working relationship that emerged despite the drawn weapon. Cawl had done the cultural homework. He showed up to a chaos invasion with Necron literary theory in his background files. Trazyn, who has been attempting to have an interesting conversation with someone for approximately 65 million years, found this notable. Trazyn revealed the full activation sequence for the Cadian pylon network. Cawl worked the activation while Trazyn opened his Tesseract labyrinths and released what the sources describe as potent defenders of the Imperium in days past. Warriors he had been preserving for decades, relabeled by Trazyn as reinforcements and deployed to buy Cawl time to complete the technical work. Trazyn considers this a normal use of his collection. The network was activating. The Eye of Terror was beginning to close. Abaddon's response wasn't tactical. He took the damaged Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity and aimed it at the planet's surface as a kinetic impactor. The pylon network was destroyed. Most of the defenders died. Cadia fell. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, tore open across the galaxy, a warp storm of such scale that it divided the Imperium into two isolated halves and turned navigation and communication across half of human space into a matter of prayer rather than calculation. The existing solution had been destroyed. The same work had to be done again, at a larger scale, against a wider problem, without the convenient pre-existing infrastructure of a planetary network. This pattern, Cawl working alongside Necrons, their cooperation not always strictly enthusiastic, isn't a Cadia-specific arrangement. It's structural. Cawl studies Necron civilization in his spare time. He is almost certainly the only figure in the Imperium who would draw a weapon on Trazyn, then holster it and reach a productive operational partnership. And the reason is that he came prepared to understand what he was talking to. The community shorthand captures it accurately. Cawl is always working with Necrons. They're just not always willing. Belisarius Cawl, Archmagos, by Guy Haley, is where the next step happens. Cawl's objective in this novel is the retrieval of control codes preserved on an ancient Necron world, needed to operate pylon technology at the scale required to stabilize the Atalan Gap. A passage through the Cicatrix Maledictum, a potential corridor through the divided galaxy that, if stable, changes the strategic geometry of the Imperium's split condition. The Lexicanum Pylon article confirms the application directly. Cawl later attempted to utilize technology derived from Necron pylons to stabilize the Atalan Gate to Imperium Nihilus. That is what this mission is for. The complication is where the target world is located. The planet is trapped on the event horizon of a black hole, occupying a temporal position that is simultaneously accessible now and, by relativistic accounting, 65 million years ago. That is the setting. 2 sentences is all it requires. The operational significance isn't the physics, but the implicit difficulty. A Necron world orbiting a stellar mass so large it has bent time around itself, filled with technology from before the Imperium's ancestors were building their first fires. And Cawl needs to walk in there and take something. The question of what exactly he walks into is complicated by the book's release timing relative to this writing, meaning a complete tactical breakdown of the Archmagos mission's specific encounters isn't yet fully established across confirmed canonical sources. What is established is the structural dynamic, consistent with every preceding operation. Cawl needs something from a Necron installation. He goes and gets it. The specific Necron entity's enthusiasm for the arrangement isn't, historically, a determining factor in whether the arrangement proceeds. What the mission represents in Cawl's operational history is the immediate successor to Cadia, the attempt to rebuild, at a larger scale, the capability that Abaddon destroyed by pointing a spaceship at it. It isn't a side project. it isn't a curiosity. It's the attempt to undo the single largest strategic reversal the Imperium has suffered in Cawl's operational lifetime, executed by the man who had the closest thing to a solution before Abaddon's kinetic impactor rendered it irrelevant. He retrieved the control codes. He stabilized the Atalan gap. The needle was threaded. Here is what actually threading that needle means in context. The capability Cawl now holds, control codes for Necron pylon technology, applicable at the scale required to stabilize a passage through the Great Rift, extends well beyond the immediate navigation problem. The documented function of the Cadian network at full activation was approaching full closure of the Eye of Terror from real space. Whatever Cawl constructs or enables with these codes has strategic implications that scale with the ambition of whoever is deploying against the Imperium next. The Cicatrix Maledictum isn't the only warp-based threat with structural relevance. The shadow in the warp, the psychic suppression field that Tyranid hive fleets project ahead of themselves, blinding psykers and severing communication across affected sectors, operates on a principle that is at least conceptually adjacent to what pylons suppress. Whether Necron warp-dampening technology at scale could interface with a Tyranid psychic effect isn't established in confirmed lore. It remains a bounded inference from the established capability, not a stated fact. The Emperor's situation, sustained on the Golden Throne, which is itself failing, which is itself a problem that has been escalating since the heresy, represents another application space that the community raises whenever pylon capability is discussed, for obvious reasons. If you have technology that fundamentally interferes with the warp's relationship to real space, and the Emperor's continuity depends on a mechanism that bridges both, the conceptual intersection isn't invisible. These aren't confirmed applications. They are the logical terminus of a question the confirmed lore opens without answering. What is confirmed is the strategic precedent. At Cadia, a functioning pylon network was suppressing the Eye of Terror so effectively that Abaddon decided to destroy a planet rather than let it finish activating. That is the data point. Everything following its inference, but the inference goes in one direction. The forward-looking stakes that the community tracks, the anticipated 14th Black Crusade, the Space Wolves prophecy surrounding what is called the Wolf Time, the predicted return of Leman Russ that various threads of 40K lore gesture toward. None of that is confirmed lore, and stating it as confirmed fact would be misrepresenting the material. But the strategic value of functional large-scale warp suppression technology against any major chaos assault on a more sensitive target than Cadia extrapolates directly from what happened at Cadia. You don't need prophecy to calculate what Cawl's acquisition is worth if the next assault goes toward Terra. Abaddon knows what he lost at Cadia. He knows what the pylon network almost did. Whatever the 14th Crusade looks like when it arrives, it will account for the possibility that the problem he solved by crashing a Blackstone fortress into a planet has been rebuilt by the one Archmagos in the Imperium who was already studying pylon technology before the 13th Crusade arrived. Now the Trazyn problem. The fall of Cadia established the Cawl-Trazyn dynamic clearly. Temporary alignment of interests held for the duration of the crisis, functioning well enough to activate a planetary pylon network, and dissolved when Abaddon destroyed the planet and the shared objective became moot. Trazyn helped. Trazyn was genuine about helping. Trazyn's motivation, preservation of a galaxy worth collecting, produced real military cooperation, including releasing warriors from Tesseract labyrinths to cover Cawl's technical work. That cooperation wasn't a binding treaty. It was a transaction with mutually aligned interests on a specific date against a specific threat with a specific outcome. Those conditions no longer fully apply. Trazyn's collection isn't organized by whether he had the original owner's permission. His gallery on Solemnus spans a moon. It contains Catan shards. It contains warriors preserved across time spans that make the Imperium look like a recent development. It contains objects described as items of extraordinary historical importance that Trazyn identified as interesting enough to want nearby. The collection operates on Trazyn's assessment of what deserves preservation, and his track record on that assessment has a very wide definition of preservation. No canonical source places Trazyn making a documented move against Cawl's Archmagos acquisition specifically. The threat isn't in any single stated moment. It's in the structural logic of who Trazyn is, a collector who has already demonstrated direct interest in pylon technology, who assisted in the activation of one pylon network, and therefore has intimate operational knowledge of what that technology can do, who collects objects of extraordinary historical significance, and who is now aware, through his orrery if nothing else, that Cawl has retrieved control codes for a Necron world's pylon systems from an event horizon location that is technically 65 million years old. The description, ancient Necron world's pylon control codes retrieved from a black hole's event horizon by the Imperium's foremost Necron technology researcher, is precisely the kind of object entry that ends up in Trazyn's catalog. The age alone qualifies it. The operational significance amplifies that. The sheer improbability of the acquisition method makes it a story worth adding to the gallery. His interest at Cadian was in keeping the galaxy intact because a destroyed galaxy produces nothing worth collecting. His interest in Cawl's acquisition is different in kind, not preservation of a general condition, but acquisition of a specific artifact. Those aren't the same interest. The first aligned with Cawl's goals, the second does not. Somewhere on Solemnus, in the gallery that spans a moon, a calculation is running. Something new has been filed under items of interest. Trazyn has 65 million years of patience for the right moment to present itself, and the right moment does not announce its arrival in advance. Cawl might want to check his inventory frequently, assign someone with sufficiently paranoid security protocols. Maybe a version of QVO who has nothing better to do. He has several available. Here is what the heist actually cost Belisarius Cawl, and why the framing matters. The surface cost involves logistics, operational risk, and the predictable political consequences of a 10,000-year-old Archmagos conducting an unauthorized extraction of control codes from Necron technology on the event horizon of a black hole. The Adeptus Mechanicus has been generating official disapproval of Cawl's methods since before most of its current administrators were born. That cost is real and ongoing, and appears to function as mild background noise rather than a meaningful constraint. The cost the title is asking about runs deeper. Every major Cawl operation, every galaxy brain scheme, every pylon network activated or retrieved, every Primaris Marine delivered, every impossible needle threaded, happens inside a life where QVO 89 is somewhere on the ship manifest. Every triumph shares operational space with the one specific failure that iteration and refinement and the full technical resources of the Imperium's most capable mind can't close. The Attilian gap is stabilized, the control codes are in hand, and Cawl's closest companion is a person he built out of grief and technical capability combined, who is more accurate to the original than the previous 88, and who is still not the person the project is actually for. The iterative improvement is the part that keeps it acute rather than blunt. If the clone series had stalled at iteration 1 and never advanced, the failure would be static, a ceiling hit and accepted. But each QVO is closer to Friedish than the last. Cawl is getting better at this. He is applying the same engineering discipline to the QVO series that he applies to everything else in his operational life. Identify the gap, refine the model, improve the output, close the distance by whatever increment this cycle allows. He is, by any technical measure, converging on the original. And the answer stays the same. Trazyn observed that Cawl has gladly sliced away his humanity, piece by piece, and the observation was accurate as a general description of the Archmagos across 10,000 years. What Trazyn didn't include, possibly because the observation was made before Trazyn had full visibility into Cawl's personal inventory, is that the slicing hasn't been total. The part of Cawl that keeps building QVO isn't the Archmagos. It isn't the engineer. It's whatever is left of whoever Cawl was before he started replacing himself. The part that found one specific person irreplaceable and has spent 10,000 years applying every available tool to proving that finding wrong. The 89th iteration of that proof is still running. The plot armor is real. The community that describes it as weighing more than a neutron star isn't wrong. It's a structurally accurate characterization of how the narrative treats Cawl. Every needle gets threaded. The Primaris Marines worked. The Cadian pylons activated, and even after Abaddon destroyed the planet, Cawl went and found new ones. The Archmagos mission succeeded. The Attilan gap is stable. Another impossible plan has executed on the timescale Cawl assigned it. The plot armor does not cover this. It was never designed for this. Cawl's contingency planning runs across geological spans of time, but no contingency exists in the record for the moment QVO looks at him and delivers those same 5 words. No iteration of the plan produces a different answer. The engineering discipline that threads every other needle runs directly into a problem that is immune to engineering discipline, because the problem isn't technical. Friedish is gone. The patterns are gone. What Cawl can reconstruct is an asymptote, a curve that approaches the limit forever without reaching it, refined per iteration, accurate and improving and permanently incomplete. Both things are simultaneously true about the same Archmagos, running in the same operational life, and neither cancels the other. Cawl threads impossible needles while failing at the same personal mission he has been running for 10,000 years. The wins and the failure coexist in the same profile. The plot armor covers the galaxy saving. It does not cover the part of him that keeps the iteration count climbing past 80 and into the 90s because some calculation he can't fully override keeps returning the same output. Try again. That is what it cost him. Not the heist itself. The heist succeeded, as heists by Belisarius Cawl reliably do. The cost is carried in the quiet operational fact that the most complete archive of Necron pylon technology now accessible to the Imperium was assembled by the same man whose most personal project has been returning the same error message for nearly a century of attempts. QVO 89 is on the ship. The Attilan gap is stable. Trazyn is somewhere on Solemnus with 65 million years of patience and an orrery that knows what Cawl just acquired. The needle was threaded. The next one is already loading. Subscribe for more stories like this one.